A full rack of ribs.
Jimmy, baby, back ribs.
The Baconator.
Baconator is the ultimate bacon cheeseburger.
Steak and eggs. Americans love meat.
Meat.
In the last 50 plus years, meat consumption in the US increased by 40%, placing it behind only Hong Kong for highest meat consumption in the world. Americans eat 274 pounds of meat per year on average. That's a lot of meat. In contrast, the average Japanese citizen consumes 108 pounds per year. While these statistics may be shocking, meat consumption in the United States has been abnormally high for centuries.
When something good happens in your life and you go to celebrate, you're celebrating with a steak.
Culturally, meat has become part of our story and part of at least our stereotype, if not our identity.
To the average British colonist arriving in the 1600s, the amount of land available for farming was baffling. That's because back in Britain, land was controlled only by the upper class.
Some people here may remember the legend of Robin Hood, and what's his big crime? Hunting on the nobles' lands.
Of course, this land was only perceived to be available. Native Americans inhabited much of what the colonists viewed as available. Nevertheless, settlers took the opportunity to produce a luxury good in previously unheard of quantities.
As early as the 1720s, farms were specializing in the production of meat animals intended to be sold in urban areas for the urban population. So not only do the rural areas have meat, but the cities have meat.
Back in Europe, access to meat was something everyday people could only dream of. So when immigrants wrote back to their loved ones about how much meat they were consuming daily here in the United States, it said that the Europeans back home were in shock. The availability of meat in America directly contrasted with countries like France, in which the king controlled the trade of livestock.
You couldn't just, get a bunch of cows together, march them towards Paris, and sell them at an auction. No, that was all regulated and controlled.
In America, land was plentiful and production of meat was decentralized. For example, in New York, farmers could bring animals to the city taverns and local butchers would buy them.
And we have studies of probate inventories in the 18th century in which you see that Americans are eating about 150 pounds of meat per year. There's no place else in the world at that time where so much meat is being eaten.
But then something happened that beefed up this already meaty business. The Industrial Revolution. Midwestern cities like Chicago had convenient access to surrounding rural lands nearby. This meant they could fatten the animals just outside the city and bring them back to a large industrial workforce for slaughter, packing, and transportation. As mechanical refrigeration continued to develop and the invention of the refrigerated rail car was introduced, it supercharged meatpacking into a year-round business. Refrigerated rail cars also allowed the transport of more meat to more people. Before, only pigs could be distributed across long distances. That's because they could be dry cured with salt or be put in barrels full of very salty water for preservation. You know the saying, bottom of the barrel? Yeah, it's about this. Chicago, with its expanding railroad system, quickly grew into the meat processing capital of the US. Local farmers no longer sold their products directly to small-town butchers. Instead, massive slaughterhouses were responsible for distribution. In other words, a centralized meatpacking industry was born. Fun fact, New York's famous meatpacking district, now a trendy spot for nightlife, was once home to hundreds of slaughterhouses. With the expansion of the industry, meat made its way onto the American dinner, lunch, and even breakfast plate. It not only satisfied our taste buds, but also became an item that was expected to be available. Which means when companies tried to raise prices, customers revolted.
Periodically, there'd be price jumps because for a number of reasons, and consumers would riot. The most famous being 1902, there were these big riots among Jewish consumers against the price increases in kosher meat.
Because at a certain point, once it becomes a habit, it becomes expected.
Cultural expectations for food are sticky. because we develop them through the endless repetition of experiences with our family. So why do we expect this? Because this is what your grandparents fed you on Thanksgiving. This is what your parents fed for a Friday night meal. This is what happened over and over again. So by the time you're growing up yourself, you absorb that expectation of meat in certain places at certain times.
But economists argue there's one thing it all boils down to in the end.
If I were to ask you how Americans became so obsessed with meat, you would say?
Americans became so obsessed with meat because we could afford it and we like it.
Since the 1960s, meat consumption has only increased, but American preferences have changed. Beef was the choice of meat during the 20th century, but today, chicken is the front runner in our supermarkets. And that's not just because chicken is cheaper. Beef is also in the midst of a PR crisis. Over the last 20 years, the beef industry has had to face new questions about environmental costs and its inherent risks to human health. But this doesn't mean the demand for beef will go away anytime soon. Instead, meatless products like the Impossible Burger are looking to fill that space. But experts say these products may not be the entire solution, as they have their own sets of flaws.
They come close, and they're really okay until you read the ingredient list. And then once you read the ingredient list, you're into ultra-processed food territory, and it raises eyebrows.
Instead, researchers believe that the future will still include meat, but speculate less of it.
I think that as we go forward, a lot of people are going to become more and more flexitarian, especially, and really cutting out meat a few days a week, eating meat in smaller portions once, twice a week, for example.
So while the US could move closer to a meatless reality, developing nations with new access to affordable quantities of meat may take their place. Because the more money a country has, the more meat they consume.
And we have seen this in other countries where as their economy develops and their peoples have more disposable income, they start to put more meat into their diet.
And if we know anything about meat accessibility, maybe one day those other countries will become just as obsessed as us Americans. What do you think the future of meat will look like? Write below in the comments and make sure to like and subscribe for more.